Alright, for this tutorial you'll need about a yard of fabric. You'll need some 3/8 of an inch thick elastic, and have about a yard of that. You'll need some coordinating thread, some sewing pins, you'll need a seam ripper, you'll need a pencil or paper marking tool, you'll need a ruler, some paper scissors, some fabric scissors, and you will also need a loop turner. But if you do not have one, I will demonstrate how to sew the necktie so that if you don't have this, we'll still make it happen. And also you will need simplicity pattern 1-1. Let me see, I'm about to say too many ones. 11-12. So 1-1-1-2. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Go ahead and flip your pattern over to the back and find where it says bust. You want to follow that over and find your bust measurement. Now for me, that is 36. So I am going to cut out the 14. Alright, next we're going to shorten pattern pieces 1 and 2. So what you want to do is on your pattern, find where it says waistline, and next to waistline you'll see a line. What you want to do is take your ruler and you want to draw a line, straight line right across. I'll use my Sharpie so you all can see. And then next you have two options. Either you can cut across this line, or if you want to preserve the pattern, you can fold it right on that line. And also fold away any excess. Alright, go ahead and do the same exact thing to pattern piece number 2. Alright, when cutting out your pattern pieces, go ahead and lay your fabric with the selvage edge to the selvage edge and have the right sides together. Next you will take pattern piece number 1, and it says to cut it on the fold. So right here is the fold of your fabric, and you would line up this pattern piece with the fold. I went ahead and placed pattern piece number 2 right next to pattern piece number 1. Depending on the size you cut, you may have to place pattern piece number 2 right under number 1. Go ahead and pin this in place and cut it out. Alright, next we need to transfer our markings onto our fabric. So right here on the side you'll see that there is a notch that we need to make. So it looks like a triangle. And you just make like a little snip, so don't cut too deep into your fabric. And then on the other side you'll see that there are 3 notches that we need to make, so I'm going to make 3 small snips. And also on pattern piece number 2 you'll see some dots here. So what you want to do is find the size that you cut out. So I cut out the 12, so I'm going to place my pin through the 12. And then I'm going to take my fabric marking tool and right there I'm just going to make a mark. Then I'm going to flip everything over, and right where the pin is coming out, I'm also going to make a mark. And for a pattern, and go ahead and do the same thing for pattern piece number 1. I think there's only 1 notch here that you need to make a snippet for. Alright, to cut out the necktie piece, I did cut it out on the cross grain. So what that means is I opened it up, my fabric, And then now I have the selvage edge to the selvage edge down here at the bottom. And I laid my necktie going the cross grain way of the fabric, opposed to going with the grain, which would have been in this direction. And I did this because, you know, I'm saving fabric and it's just some neckties, so it really doesn't matter. It doesn't need to stretch. So this cutting it on the cross grain helped me to save fabric because I'm going to make a skirt out of the rest of this. All right, next go ahead and finish off your raw edges at the top, the bottom, and the sides. The only part that you don't need to finish off is the armhole area. And on the back, you're finishing off the sides, the bottom, the top, the center back. You don't need to do this area here. That is the armhole area. Alright, next take your back pieces and we're going to pin these right sides together. So I have the right side touching the right side of the fabric, and you want to line it up. Then you want to find where you made that, where you transferred your marking for the dot, and you want to place a pin there. And then you want to pin along the edge here, making sure that the notches line up. Next, we'll sew a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance from this dot all the way down. Alright, starting from the bottom of the shirt, we're going to sew up until we get to our large dot. So go ahead and lower your needle. Start sewing, back stitch. And then once you get to your dot, go ahead and back stitch. Now go ahead and take this to your iron and press this seam open. From the large dot down, we went ahead and pressed this seam open. Now from the large dot up, we need to fold it over 5/8 of an inch and press it down in place. And then we're going to now run a stitch down, then we'll pivot and then come back up. So go ahead and press both sides. Alright, now I'm on the right side of my shirt and I'm starting right at the top, and I lined up my fabric with 1/2 inch seam allowance. So go ahead and lower your needle, begin sewing, back stitch, so once you get past the large dot that we made, you can go ahead and lower your needle, lift up your presser foot and turn, then lower your presser foot, keep sewing, then pause, make sure your needle is left down in your fabric, lift up your presser foot, turn, make sure you're back at a 1/2 inch, lower your needle and keep sewing all the way up. And then once you sew the back, then you would open it up and take the front piece and lay these two right sides together, and you're going to pin along the sides. We'll pin along the sides and then we will sew these up. Alright, to sew up the sides, we're going to use 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So go ahead and lower your needle, begin sewing, back stitch. And go ahead and press this seam. Open. Alright, next go ahead and turn your shirt to the right side facing out, and we're going to be working in the armhole area. So grab your bias tape and your pins. Now what you want to do is take your bias tape, and you'll notice on the back that there are two flaps. So on the other side, this is considered the right side. So what we want to do is open up one of the tabs or flap, and you want to pin it on the right side of your shirt. So we're going to do that all the way around the armhole, lifting that flap open and pinning in place. You will continue following these steps around the entire armhole, lifting up the flap of the bias tape and pinning it in place to your shirt. Well, once you get to the other side of your shirt, go ahead and trim the bias tape. And now we're going to sew a 3/8 of a seam allowance all the way around. Go ahead and lower your needle. Begin sewing, back stitch. Alright, so we have to trim the seam allowance down. So I'm using this crease here as a guide for where I'm going to trim. Alright, now we need to press this open. So what you want to do is take this, you want to take the bias tape and the rest of the seam allowance, and you're going to press it away from the shirt. So right now it's just laying right on top of our shirt. When we get ready to press, we're going to open it up and then press it away. So the whole way around the armhole, pressing the bias tape and the seam allowance away from our shirt. Alright, so in the curved area of our armhole, we need to cut some notches. So right in the curve area, you want to take your scissors and you want to cut close to the stitch line, but you don't want to cut through your stitches. So I'm just making little slits. Alright, so now it's time for us to understitch. So right now we have our seam allowance and our bias tape pressed away from our shirt. And here, my stitches are white, so I've just gone ahead and used my fabric tool to show you. That's my stitches. And what we need to do is understitch. So what that means is we need to do another row of stitches that is close to our stitch line. So I'm going to mark what that looks like with my purple fabric marker. So that means we need to do another row of stitches very close to our stitch line. So right here, the purple, I'm demonstrating how, when we get ready to sew on our sewing machine, how close you will need to be to your actual stitch line. Alright, so when I begin stitching, I'm going to stitch as close as possible to these stitching lines here. Now this is the seam allowance and the bias tape, and that's where I will be stitching on top of. So I'm going to try to get I'm going to get right close in here. So staying close to these stitches, but not stitching on top, just close in the seam allowance. Alright, so here's a close-up of my understitches. It's these stitches right here. So these ones on this side were my original ones that I used to sew my bias tape and my shirt together. And then when I went in with the to do the understitch, these are the stitches that I made. Alright. So now it's time to turn our bias tape and press it in place. So go ahead, and I'm looking at the right side of my shirt. I'm going to take my bias tape and I'm going to fold it under. And then I'm going to press this down in place. Alright, so I'm on the wrong side of my shirt. And right here is our bias tape that we pressed down. So what we want to do is run a stitch right along the edge of our, right on top of our bias tape on the edge. So go ahead and lower your needle, begin sewing, back stitch. Alright, so go ahead and turn your shirt to the wrong side, facing out, and we are going to make the casing at the top part of our shirt. So right now this is the top edge of the back, and this is an index card, and I went ahead, I have a line here marked for 7/8 of an inch seam allowance. So what I'm going to do is fold over the top part of my shirt, and I'm going to meet it with that 7/8 of an inch line. I'm going to take my iron and press. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side of my shirt in the back. I'm going to fold it up 7/8 of an inch and press. Then you will turn it over to the front and do the same exact thing to the front part of your shirt. Folding it over till you meet that line and press. Alright, to create my casing, I'm on the right side of my fabric and I have it lined up with 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. Alright, so I'm going to lower my needle to meet the stitching lines that are already on my shirt. So go ahead and begin sewing, back stitch, and sew all the way down until you meet the stitching lines at the opposite end of your shirt. Alright, go ahead and grab your ties, and we're going to lay these two right sides together, and we're working on the side that has where we cut a notch. So right at that notch, go ahead and pin in place. So go ahead and run a 5/8 of an inch stitch along here, and we'll sew these two pieces together. And then on the opposite ends, so these are the two sides. Alright, so on the opposite ends of the ties where there's no notch cut, we want to fold over a 1/2 inch. So right now I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm going to turn over 1/2 inch and press that in place. Same thing with the other one. I'm using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to sew these two ties together. Alright, and you can press this seam open. Alright, so now I'm looking at the right side of the tie. What we want to do is now fold it in half so that the right sides are together, and we're going to pin that in place. So continually folding in half, making sure that the right side is on the inside, and you're going to continue pinning the tube in place. Alright, now it's time to close up our tie. So I have the raw edge of the tie lined up with the edge of the presser foot. Go ahead and lower your needle. Begin sewing, backstitch. Alright, now it's time to turn your tube. Go ahead and take your loop turner and push it through all the way to the other side. Alright, once you're through to the other side, go ahead and latch it onto the end. So it's pushing that little piece through your fabric. Then close it up. And then you want to begin gently pulling your fabric over the loop. Continue pulling the fabric and the loop turner in opposite directions. Now, once the fabric becomes visible on the other side, go ahead and take the loop turner off and then begin pulling still in opposite directions until all the right side of the fabric is out. Alright, if you do not have a loop turner, then you can opt to fold your tie in a different way. So for example, say this is the wrong side of your fabric, you would fold 1/2 over to meet the center, and then you'd press it in place. Then you take the other side and fold it in half. To meet the other side. So I folded 1/2 over, and then I folded the other half over. Then you'd press both of those down in place. Then you would now fold it in half one more time. And you'd press that in place. That way you'd have a clean edge, and your raw sides, your raw edges are now hidden on the inside. Then you would run a stitch across to hold it in place. Go ahead and put your safety pin at the end, at one of the ends of your ties. Then starting at the back of your shirt, we're going to, and this is on the center back of your shirt, we're going to insert the tie. So you're pushing the safety pin through and then you're pulling. Now once you're through to the other side, we're going to move to the front. So flip it over. Make sure you keep your tie nice and straight. And now we're going through the front of the shirt. And once you're through to the other side, go ahead and flip it back over. And we're going to now insert it through the other casing on the back piece. Alright, and when you wear it, you can go ahead and adjust the ties how you would like. Now it's time to make the casing at the bottom of our shirt. So the wrong side is facing out. And on my index card, I have 3/4 of an inch marked. That's how much we want to turn up. What you want to do is turn up the bottom of your shirt to meet that 3/4 of an inch mark, and you want to take your iron and press. So you're going to do that all the way around the bottom edge of your shirt. Alright, so before we sew our elastic casing closed, we need to base down the flaps of our seam allowance down at the bottom. So I'm looking at the bottom edge of the shirt right now. So what we want to do is we want to run a stitch as close to the edge of each side of our seam allowance. That way when we insert our elastic, we won't get caught trying to push through this seam allowance. So I have my needle lined up close to the edge of this seam allowance. So just go ahead and start sewing. You do not need to backstitch. And I'm sewing up about an inch. And I'll just raise your needle, don't backstitch, just trim your threads. And do the same thing to the other side. Stitch as close as you can to the edge. No need to backstitch when doing this. After we insert our elastic, we will use our seam ripper to take these stitches out. Alright, now it's time to sew the casing for the bottom part of our shirt. So I went ahead and placed a pin to mark the starting and a stopping point. And then right in between here, it's about an inch. This is where we will insert our elastic. So I'm going to line up my fabric. I'm going to line up the bottom edge with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go ahead and lower your needle, begin sewing, backstitch, and we're going to sew all the way around until we get to our stopping point. Alright, when you get to your stopping pin, go ahead and backstitch. Alright, go ahead and take your elastic, grab your safety pin, and we're going to place our safety pin right at the edge of our elastic. And right at that opening, go ahead and insert that safety pin. And you want to use the safety pin to guide you through the casing. So go ahead and start pushing the fabric over the safety pin. Then with your right hand hold it in place, and then with your left hand pull the fabric over the elastic. So keep pushing and then pulling. Alright, once you're through to the other side, go ahead and take off your safety pin. And what you want to do is go ahead and overlap your elastic about 1/2 inch. And go ahead and pin that in place. And right and right where we overlapped, we're going to do a zigzag stitch. Alright, so I placed my presser foot right on top where I overlapped the elastic. So I went ahead and switched over to a zigzag stitch. Go ahead and lower your needle and begin sewing. And then back stitch. Then go ahead and start sewing and back stitch. So you want to do this a few times. Go ahead and start sewing again. Back stitch. And I'm going to do it one more time. Alright, so you just want to do it enough so that it'll secure your elastic in place. Alright, now go ahead and put your elastic inside of the casing. And right where this opening is, we need to close it up. So what I'm going to do is pin my elastic out of the way so it won't get caught in my stitches. So make sure you switch back over to your straight stitch. So right where you left off, that's where we're going to start our needle. We'll place our needle.